and mic off. So the subject for this panel is Writing Towards Liberty and Justice for All. In this Speak Up, Speak Out panel, authors Dr. Nicholas Estes, Charlene Carruthers, and Adolfo Flores will be discussing the current state of the police force, National Guard, and ICE through the lens of Black, Indigenous, and Latinx community reformation. Dr. Ayanna Thompson, director of the Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies and creator of the Race Before Race academic conference series, will lead our panel through a conversation about how to engage with the past and define the future. Thank you so much for all coming. And Dr. Thompson, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be on this panel with three writers, thinkers, activists that I admire. And I think we'll start off thinking about the way that you think writing plays in the activism you do. How does your writing or communication figure into the way that you are trying to rally your communities against police violence or ICE raids, or just sort of the kind of militarization of all of our armed forces? I'll let Nick start.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for having me on this panel. And I was thinking about the topic of this particular discussion, but then it gets to the question that you just asked. And when you think about our role as writers, there's kind of like a basic formula of writing, which is situation and story, right? What's the situation that we find ourselves in, the context? It's everything that has come to define 2020, right? We can point to the George Floyd protests, we can point to the pandemic, we can point to the toppling of colonial statues, but the story is distorted, right? The story has come to be defined by those in power as reducible to Trump v. Biden, right? And they are the protagonists, allegedly, in the story, right? But as we all know, as people who are writers and committed to these particular movements, that we know the protagonists of the story is those who are in the streets right now as we speak, right? They're the ones. The only reason Breonna Taylor, the only reason why they had a sham grand jury investigation is because people were in the streets. They had to respond, right? The only reason why we were able to topple colonial statues that we have spent decades, the only reason why we've been able to retire racist sport mascots is because of decades of organizing on behalf of everyday people, right? Those are the stories that we need to write about in this particular situation. And so I'll just end it there and pass it over to the other co-panelists.
Yeah, Charlene, I wonder if you could go next, because in thinking about the way that you've been organizing and some of the things that you talk about in your book about principled struggle, healing justice, leadership development, can you talk through what role writing and communication plays, like strategic communication plays in the activism that you've done?
Absolutely. So I am a strong believer in and not just believer, but I know based on the work that I've been involved in, my study of history, and just being in relationship with other people, that in fact, like, storytelling is a part of the glue that brings people. It's like it's the magnet that brings people into movement. It's the thing that keeps many people in movement. It's a thing that people connect to in so many ways. And so writing has communication broadly is always a part of movement building, whether it's through writing, whether it's through other visual projects, whether it's visual, audio, whatever that is. Like, humans communicate and learn in so many different ways. And for me, writing has become one of my primary mediums, because writing endures in ways and that other things perhaps may not. Like, I can give a speech at a protest and don't nobody remember what I said. Like, it could be recorded, but like, writing can be revisited. And I think we need everything, right? We need that moment of the story, the communications that happens at the protest, the march, the rally. And we also need things to revisit, things to go back to. And I definitely see myself as an organizer, as a cultural worker, and as an intellectual within the Black radical tradition. And as Cedric Robinson talked about the Black radical tradition as well, he didn't talk about it in these exact terms, but this is how I think of it. He's the one who like really coined the term, to my knowledge. It is the resistance and the resilience work in post-colonial and also in the era of the transatlantic slave trade, post-chattel slavery in the Western Hemisphere, all of those things up through Jim Crow, up through independence movements on the continent and in the Caribbean and other parts of the Western Hemisphere as well, both our resistance and our resilience work to do a remaking, a reimagination, a redoing of society and the world. And so writing has always been a part of that. And I see my work as an organizer is to also like organize ideas and organize stories. And so writing, be it in the book form, in an essay form, poetry, I'm working on a novel now, it's whatever. And the last thing I'll say here is that writing allows me to get the stuff that's in my head out on paper in ways that other exercises don't.
Yeah. Adolfo, as our resident reporter, obviously writing is your life and your livelihood. I wonder how you decided to choose that route and what part of storytelling, how that plays in the way you think of your relationship to your community.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting that when Charlene was talking about how writing, you can revisit it. And I think that's part of why I chose that over, maybe TV or radio, which is very immediate and has, I would argue, sometimes a larger impact. But I mean, writing, not to diminish what I do, but it seemed to me like a really good way of being able to think about what I'm writing, what I'm looking at, and condensing it in a way that people understand. And I just like that about writing. Is like I can take a little, sometimes not so much time, but sometimes you can take time and put out all your thoughts. And that to me is what attracted me to it. My role here is a little different, right? I'm not an activist, and what I try to do though is point out flaws in systems and whether that's ICE detainee deaths or Border Patrol, CBP's lack of accountability, despite being a law enforcement agency, I leave it to other people to decide what to do. But I don't know, and writing I think just helps me process in a way I don't think I could do very well if I was on radio or television.
Yeah.
So.
Can I have one more thing?
Please, of course.
Okay, I don't know if this was going to come up later. I think we have an opportunity and I think a charge for many of us who do movement work, no matter what space you do it in or out of, to like write our own stories. Like, I don't think one of the things that I saw over and over again, and I continue to see, are people who have never organized a thing, who have never participated. You don't even have to be the organizer. Have you participated in the thing, writing about it, and speaking of it from a place of expertise? And I'm like, wait a minute. And I understand that like there's a certain like closeness or that you can have if you're in the thing and whatever, but I don't believe in objectivity. I don't believe in perfect objectivity, period, anyway. And I know that's like taboo, I guess, maybe in like journalism, but they lie about their objectiveness so often. But writing for people who are involved in movement in any kind of way allows us to tell a more complete story about our social movements than I believe that many people who are distant from it, and especially if writing in real time, are able to do. And so I'm always encouraging activists and organizers to actually do writing.
Yeah. So right in the midst of the pandemic and right before George Floyd's murder, I was working on a book on blackface and the history of blackface minstrelsy and the long tradition and why it keeps coming back to us in the 21st century. And I have to say that after George Floyd's murder, I wasn't sure I could keep writing about it because it felt so painful and so too much on the point. But I was able to work through a lot of the kind of emotional turmoil through the writing. So I wonder if you all think of your writing as being part of resiliency work, or if you see them in conflict ever, because I think different people have a different relationship with how to self-care and writing. Are they together or are they separate? Nick, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Yeah, I guess like it's more about the personal, and you can't separate who you are. Like, so for example, even in my own profession as, you know, like as a historian, that's where I was trained, like even going into the archives and saying, hey, look, the nature of the state is authoritarian because we literally don't have access to our own lands. Like we literally don't own our land. Oh, well, you're an activist. Like that's not, we don't do activist journalism or scholarship here. Like you need to be objective. And I was like, as a historian, that's a very politically charged thing to say, one, you are in pursuit of truth, because truth is one of the most theoretical things that one can be in pursuit of, but nonetheless to dismiss entire bodies of knowledges, entire histories that are from this land as quote unquote activists is a way to diminish and to actually undermine the voices of indigenous people, but also other people. And it's part of the systemic problem. And I just don't have any patience for that mentality anymore. And I don't actually consider myself an activist. That label is applied to me by people who want to diminish what I do. And I agree with Charlene just saying that y'all are liars. Like I've literally witnessed in court cases, historians, people who we hold up as the arbiters of truth, lie specifically for to diminish the rights of indigenous people to a land base and to dehumanize them, right? The fact that we still have, like, if we want to talk about, you know, the legacy of, you know, certain individuals, like such as Ruth Bader Ginsburg actually upheld a racist fiction of indigenous people, that we had no right to our land, that we were one step below animals in terms of our rationality and humanity. And that's called the Doctrine of Discovery. That is a fiction that is literally legalized within our legal institutions, and that somebody who, you know, whether you agree with Ruth Bader Ginsburg or not, upholds as a doctrine of truth, right? People call us activists for saying that. It's not an activist thing to say that a pope in the 15th century decided to split the world into various races and territories and say, Portugal has a right to this and the Spanish crown has the right to this. It's something that has actually been legalized within our legal traditions and how we understand, you know, things such as like a border wall, right? A wall that separates indigenous people, the right of people to move. It's actually a legal fiction that has its origins within the Doctrine of Discovery. And so whether or not I choose to be engaged in these conversations, I'm political by default, simply because I'm an enrolled member of a tribe, of a nation of people that is under constant erasure and elimination.
I was like, because you dare to exist. Yeah. Charlene or Adolfo, I wonder if either one of you want to jump in next about, like, what's your relationship to writing in terms of resilience, or any of the terms that we've got out there now, because I think it is incredibly fraught to dare to put BIPOC knowledge and systems of inquiry into the heart of our work, right? Because of course, as Nick said, it gets called activist work by others.
I'll talk a little bit about like this, like the myth of objectivity, right? And it's like, and then I mostly experience it through journalism, but, you know, like hearing Nick talk about it, it sounds like, you know, this also happens in academia. But, you know, I think we were having these conversations, especially after the killing of George Floyd, about what is objectivity in journalism and how was that, you know, created. And when you look at it, you know, journalism was sort of like founded on that by white reporters and their white editors. And I think we have to keep that in mind as me as a Mexican reporter, and so people get called activists, but really they're just talking about the truth. And I think it comes from that belief of objectivity, which I don't think I think a lot of reporters, a lot of journalists are looking at it from a different lens. Yeah. But then to talk about resiliency, I think sometimes writing can be a way to sort of get your thoughts out there, and it helps you process and deal with the emotions of the moment. But sometimes it's too much, and you can't do that work. Like, writing doesn't actually help you. Mm-hmm. So it can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing. I journal, so to me, that's a way that I can write and sort of express my thoughts in a way that I can't at work. So yeah, it has its benefits.
Thanks. Charlene?
Absolutely. I resonate a lot with my feelings. My thoughts about it resonate a lot with what Nick and Adolfo just shared. For me, one way that I think about resilience is how some of the people in a practice community that I belong to called Black Organizing for Leadership and Dignity, and we do politicized generative somatics work. And it's so much of it is about just embodied leadership, like how we show up in our bodies, our relationship to our bodies, and how we show up in the rest of the world, whatever that means. And what they teach us is resilience is what we do to experience joy in the midst of this world that we live in, not for the sake of just bending and grinning it. Grinning. I just mixed up the words. Grinning and bearing it. Not just for taking stuff, but what do we do to bring ourselves joy, in light of trauma, in light of all of the things. And so writing is absolutely a practice of resilience for me, when I think about it that way. And even if it's a struggle, because I have a process for how I write most things. They start 10 different lines of thought that I type down or whatever. In the middle of the night, I think about it, and then I struggle through the thing. And then when I'm about a day before, a day or a couple of days before it's due, if it's a short article, my mind gets to where it needs to get. And I actually enjoy that process. It doesn't stress me out. It brings me that thinking and doing process of writing brings me to myself in ways that are generative. And as Nick noted, the personal and is political. I'm inherently whether or not, I'm a human subject to certain people and institutions, my existence is politicized whether I like it or not. And so I choose to to engage with myself as a political person and as a person experiencing politics and even shaping politics alongside other people. That matters to me. Black feminism, a core tenet of Black feminism, particularly radical Black feminisms, is that the personal is political, and that we have a responsibility to interrogate those things. And I'm not a Black feminist because I happen to be a Black woman. I'm a Black feminist because of the political values and actions that I take out in the world and also in my relationships with other people.
Absolutely. So one of the questions posed by our viewers is, with an overwhelming amount of information coming out daily about the police and ICE, et cetera, how do we share that information in a way that promotes awareness, but that doesn't become re-traumatizing or potentially worse, performative? And Adolfo, I wonder if we could start with you, and then we'll go in a different order this time.
Yes. So when that question makes me think about the video of George Floyd, or the father and daughter who drowned in the Rio Grande trying to get to the US. And I think in the beginning, they serve a purpose because they start a conversation and they start a movement But you just there comes a time when the video and the photo, it's not furthering the conversation, and I can't pinpoint it, but I think we all sort of know when that moment happens, and that is, at that point, if you're sharing the video, you have to ask yourself why. Yeah. If you're sharing that photo, you have to ask yourself why, and if you don't have a good answer, you probably shouldn't be doing it. Yeah. And so
I was wondering about this in relationship to some of the reporting you've done about the doctors in the detention centers performing performing the hysterectomies. Like how much detail, how do you make distinctions about what's going to get included and what you think is going too far?
I'll tell you right now, I'm looking at women's medical files of when they went to go see a gynecologist, and I know that them allowing me to see that is hard. I'm a guy. I can't imagine that it would be easy for them to do it. And so it's something that I think about when I'm looking at them, and when I ask them about what was done to them. It's very much in my mind so that I can at least be sensitive and convey to them that I realize that is not easy. And so if I do include details, you have to think about what is the purpose of it. If it doesn't serve a purpose for the story, then is it just gratuitous, and do we need it? No. And you have to be very picky. And this topic is very sensitive. Yeah.
I mean, it's unbelievable, right?
Yeah.
Although it's not. I mean, I guess I'll turn to Nick. It's actually not that unbelievable, is it? It's part of the longer history that we know about. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if you could talk through some of these issues too, about how do you tell the story in a way that gets the information out, but being sensitive about if there's a possibility of re-traumatizing people, or actually just doing the performative gesture of, I'm woke.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really good question. I think back to several stories that I worked on as a beat reporter, specifically around the murder of a trans woman in Gallup, New Mexico, and then the violent dismemberment of a Navajo man, or not a Navajo man, a Paiute man in Arizona, and the focus that I wanted to talk about, the fact that these were vigilante violences committed in kind of these gray areas of jurisdiction, right? Because they happen off reservation. The offender, the perpetrator is non-Indigenous, and the victim is Indigenous, and what kind of questions does that arise? Because if you flip the kind of the framework, and if the perpetrator was Indigenous and the victim was non-Indigenous, the sentencing would be much worse, because they would go through a federal processing system. So that was kind of what I was looking at, but working with editors and things like that, and people who don't share those kinds of values, look towards clickbait stuff. And we have to remember that we live under, surveillance capitalism, in the sense that these stories some outlets produce stories simply to produce commodities to be bought and sold, right, for profit. And we have to remember that, and even in our engagement on Twitter, even our engagement on social media is determined by these algorithms that are meant to sell us. We think we're customers, but actually we are the product that is being sold. And that's not a radical thing to say. It's actually the truth. We don't buy subscriptions to social media. Social media takes our behaviors and sells them to advertisers. And so it's not, I'm not giving you an answer. I don't have a perfect solution for it, but I think it's important to remember the situation and the terms in which we're operating and being storytellers, and to be frank about that.
Yeah, and even the platform we're using right now, why is Zoom free? Because it's facial recognition software. So, that's another.
Well, I'm getting off right now. So,
Charlene, did you want to hop in?
They already got my face. They got my retina scan. They got my fingerprint. They already got all my information. So it's like, oh, well, I can make it harder for them for sure. But I think that it's not possible, like, for people, particularly as we are talking about Black folks, Indigenous folks. I'm a little unsettled about the BIPOC frame. So I'm just like, how do I talk about this? Latinx people can be both Indigenous and Black people can be Indigenous and Latinx, and all of these Black people can be everything, frankly. People can be everything. But anywho, it's impossible for us to not be traumatized at some point in our lives living in this world. Like, I don't think that, on one hand, I'm sure I am clear that there's a gratuitous sharing of videos. At least I feel that, and I feel like the videos are being shared a little less these days than they used to be, or maybe at least by the people who I like follow on social media. Like it's lowered over the years. Like, people used to share them more readily. I don't share them. I remember I was very active here in Chicago in the organizing around that happened after the release of the video of the killing of Laquan McDonald by a Chicago police officer, Jason Van Dyke. And I didn't see the video until maybe a year or two later, honestly. I didn't watch it. It was probably like 2 years later before I even saw the video. I was like, wait, I'm not even sure if I'm like 100% sure what Laquan looks like, you know, because it wasn't about, what I was sure about is like this 17-year-old, I believe, shot 16 times. And that was enough for me. That was literally, I didn't need to see a video. I didn't even need to know any details. Really, I like saw like autopsy reports. I listened to other people recount, but I felt that I didn't need to see it for myself to prove that they shot this boy 16 times. You know, and Christina Sharp actually has done a lot of work around this, around the images of Black pain, Black death, Black violence against Black people, and talks about like what agitates us about what is the utility of that? Who does that serve? And so I don't think it's served, like I don't feel like people need to become more aware that that's the problem. You need to see it in order to believe it. That's not the problem. I think people need more exposure to visions and possible solutions in the work that people are doing to create a different world. So that I actually believe that it's possible, and to see a role for themselves in doing that work. That's what I am most interested in.
I was gonna add, like, for like people who want to like share or talk about this story and they want to share stuff that isn't, you know, gratuitous or doesn't re-traumatize people, you know, I would say look for like stories that put the issue into context. Because I know that when we go out and cover this, not only do we try to do stories that explain who this person was or who the people involved were, but, you know, there's data reporters looking at income inequality and graduation rates and other things that look at systemic racism. And I think those are stories I would suggest that people look for those stories and share those, because that is a step further than just like, here's this video of,
so this is actually, you know,
someone dying.
Segue, because the next question from one of the viewers is, when writing about the police, ICE, National Guard violence, what sources would you recommend for finding solid studies to be better informed in writing and in activism? So let's see, Nick, do you want to hop in with some other good sources that you use?
So yeah, it's difficult, and I'll talk about the problem. I'm not going to offer any solutions. But it's difficult because we try to do a 3-year study of police killings of Native people. And I think, you know, Charlene brought this up, but it's like, who counts as Indigenous? Because the police actually don't keep those records, and they're not obligated to. I was just pulled over the other day, and, you know, like, I got a ticket. It's totally bogus, but that's a different story. But I got a ticket, and he put on the race, he put none. And then when I was arrested, you know, and I was like held for a thing that I did at Harvard, they actually put my race as white, you know. And so there's no accurate, because first of all, they think, you know, indigeneity isn't necessarily a race. It's for some people it's defined as citizenship, you know. And it becomes difficult. And so when we were trying to track the police killing of indigenous people, oftentimes, so for example, there was a North Carolina man that was shot and killed, and his race was listed as black, even though he was, you know, Lumbee, indigenous, right? And so those were some of the challenges that we confronted. And when we expanded our definition of indigeneity, you know, and then also there were migrant folks who had been killed by police as well, that aren't, as soon as they cross the border, they're no longer recognized as indigenous, right? So those were things that we confronted when we were trying to compile this data, because there's a standard definition of American Indian, Alaska Native, which is federally recognized tribes, but that's not encompassing of everyone, right? And so that was one thing that we really found challenging, and also the inconsistencies and arrests and processing. And what I would actually recommend, you know, like I'm speaking to you all from Rapid City, and I've been to day court several times for relatives and for other things, but just going into these processing facilities, whether it's a courtroom, and just look for yourself and see what kinds of people are coming through on a daily basis. What are they pleading out to? What are they being sentenced with? Because you can't do it now because of the pandemic, but it's easier because most of it's live streamed.
That's right.
And that's where I've done a lot of my kind of data gathering and looking specifically at the story. If you can't tell the story through the data, then you can tell the story through the experience.
Mm-hmm. So the quantitative data is often missing, especially for contemporary issues around indigeneity, but also I imagine the longer history, because the archives just don't include accurate information whatsoever.
Right.
Yeah. So then the qualitative is where you've gone. So we're back to storytelling. Charlene, what sources do you look to?
Well, it's a mixture of things. In some cases, I just go straight to the source. When what was happening, when the uprising in Minneapolis began, like some of the people who were involved and some of the leaders there, I've been working with them for the past year already. So it oftentimes in local organizing or local movement context, I either have this sounds really weird to say, but in a lot of cases, I know who to call. I don't know any other way to put it. Or I know who to contact to tell me who to call, or who to follow to get information. Even because I'm not calling somebody right in the middle of the beginning of an uprising. Like, I'm not going to call you in the middle of the day when I know your uprising is heightened. I'm gonna give it some time, which I think is a practice that many more people can take up. Is to actually, particularly if you're not there, literally if you're not there, and even if you are there, but particularly for people who are not there, there's no way for you to know what's happening. Yeah. There really isn't. Even if you got the live feed, you can get snippets, but you will rarely get a robust context for what's happening in the midst of an uprising, unless you were there. And even then, if you're there, you're going to have a certain segment. And so I tend to follow people less than organizations. There are some organizations that I will follow who intentionally do the work of scanning media and then actually articulating it out to people. Mm-hmm. And saying like, hey, this is what's happening. But then I also try to cue myself into individuals to get various perspectives. And I think that is somewhat of the historian in me. I like to have multiple sources in order to make an assessment.
I was going to say, how do you feel about the kind of mainstream news coverage of the uprisings you've been involved with?
Well, in some ways it's gotten a little bit better. I remember the first question, there would be two questions they would always ask us. one question they would first ask all of us is, what do we think about the violence of the protesters? I get that question way less from reporters these days. It's a different kind of question that comes up, but it's not the same one. And the other question that will always come up was intergenerational. Do you think the problem is that the young people think this and the older people think that? And so we've actually, or particularly the strategic communicators in the field, have intentionally organized media to do better. They have intentionally done that. Like, it didn't just happen overnight that the at least mainstream media, I don't think any of it, the mainstream is leftist or even progressive, frankly. That media shifted a bit in how they talked about Black Lives Matter and movement for Black lives. There are people who actually did work to make that change.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you didn't hear about it, you didn't see it, you don't even know their names. But all of that was intentional. Like, the reason why you have a more robust story of what happened in Minneapolis, what's happening in Louisville, and other places is because people are actually intentionally organizing media and intentionally organizing our folks around communications. And so I don't trust the media any more than I trust the cops, frankly. And I surely don't trust the police because they lie all the time. And so I don't see the media as like this neutral party. I see them as an institution that has to be organized, has to be agitated, has to be called out, and
educated,
and educated and leveraged in the ways that make sense for our people.
Yeah. Adolfo, do you want to hop in? Representing the media.
No, and like it's true. Like what she's saying is that you know, we mess up, right? And so, but we all we benefit so much, and at least I have, from advocates calling me out and saying, you messed up, you did this wrong. And it's one thing to tell me I did something wrong, but it's another thing to teach me and help me. And they don't have to do that.
Right.
And yet they do it. And I think I'm a better reporter for it. But it does come with some hard lessons sometimes. So yeah, it's I appreciate it. Like and it is work that people like Charlene may do. It doesn't really get noticed, but you see the benefit of that in the coverage. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that the common reader will notice, but I think people who pay attention will see that shift. And if it leads to better coverage that is more accurate and fair, I'm all for it. I appreciate it.
Nick, have you seen a change in coverage for stories involving Indigenous peoples?
Yes and no. I think I've worked really closely with High Country News, who actually created a tribal affairs desk and has kind of pioneered, and maybe that's not the right word to use, but has really advanced, I guess, this idea that if you, if you're serious about covering Indigenous issues, you need experts, you need people who that's their kind of beat, and you need editors to do this kind of thing. And it's been interesting in this moment in time. A lot of major news outlets that could care less about my pitch a year ago now care about my pitch, and I think that's good on some hands, but also I think it's sloppy, because it's like you want to include me, but you don't even have a tribal affairs desk. It's like you can report on Russia, you can report on France because you have journalists who are there, and you have a desk, a foreign affairs desk, but you don't have any commitment, And I used to actually teach. When I would teach undergrad classes, we would read the front page of the newspaper every day to see what stories are about Indigenous people and how they're actually covered, and there are not very many. I mean, even on the New York Times, I think is a good place to talk about that, and thinking about their coverage and the people who they invite. I'll often get invited as somebody to write an opinion piece, but not like a cover story. Which is fine, I don't really mind that, but also, yeah, it has kind of shifted, but it also hasn't. You have to actually build institutions that are going to be representative of these groups of people, like Indigenous people. We're very diverse. We're 500 different Indigenous nations. We all speak different languages. We all have different worldviews. We all have different cultures. how do you encapsulate that diversity just by having one person, you know, on staff that just checked a box, you know? It doesn't, that doesn't translate into anything, right?
Yeah.
And so while there has been opportunities, you know, and there's kind of space being opened up, I think it's much more difficult, and it's much more difficult than just like bringing somebody on to write like a piece, you know, to like check your box as far as like, oh, we got the indigenous viewpoint, let's move on. But I think that comes with a larger question about our stories are always marginalized, or we're like, you know, we're part of the mosaic, so to speak, whatever that means, you know, the multicultural, whatever. But it's actually like, I would say like the Black, Indigenous, migrant experience is the experience of this land, right? Period. That's the central experience. Everything else should be periphery, because those have been kind of the driving engines of history in this country.
Absolutely. And I do feel like we're in a moment of reckoning, or struggle, at least, right? I feel like I have never been so popular in my life as I have been since June. And I have a feeling that you all are experiencing the same thing, right? Like, Charlene, are you asked to do more than ever before?
No, I'm not. I'm not really asked to do more. I mean, 2012 to 2016 were like high points in movement. And so by the time we got to June of 2020, I had already, like, I'd spent years developing different practices in a different relationship to movement. And so that means different boundaries. And you can ask me to do something, that don't mean I'm gonna say yes. You know, like there's and especially since I've transitioned back into school and being a student and not doing full-time organizing, I made a conscious decision to transition out of organizing commitments, like over a span of time. Like in June, July, and August, I was in the thick of it. Like, called to the front lines, like, put me in, coach, let me do this thing. But in August, I have to, you know, slide out. So even what I took up over the summer, it was like it was about supporting organizations. It was all about supporting organizations. And figuring that was my best and highest use, because I'd been through similar situations before. I could provide a certain level of expertise and like background knowledge, but I didn't have to like run the campaigns. I don't have to run the organizations. I'm much better positioned at this point to be in a support role. And the kind of support that to a certain extent, I wish we had, you know, several years ago. But it's okay, you know, it's fine. That's what I'm here for. And we also just have a lot of people. We have a lot of leaders. I'm not the only one. And so for anybody who like is just sucking up a lot of the space and the energy, like, to me, that's not good organizing, right? And I think for the people who are making 50 requests of you, that's not okay either. Like, you shouldn't be put in a position to be the person, or feel like you have to be one of the few people. You know, that's not okay. And so yeah, I feel fortunate to be in a community of people who respected my decision to go to school, and I trust them. They got it.
That's fantastic. It's such good advice too about, like, you know, building the network, building the community, building a group of leaders, as opposed to being the one, right? Which is an old kind of hierarchical masculinist stance, right? So what are the next steps? So one of our audience members wanted to know, what do next steps look like, and how will your writing play a role? So Nick, do you want to start us off on this one?
I'll kick it over to Adolfo, since he didn't get to answer the last question.
Oh, I'm sorry, Adolfo.
I was in terms of the last question. Like, if you want to, like, people who want to look at immigration stats and stuff. I mean, if you're not going to FOIA, which you should, like, you know, file FOIAs to get the raw data from the federal government. Anyone can do that, but that's work, and most people don't know how to do that. There are places that do that work for you. Like, I really like the Migration Policy Institute, the track at Syracuse University. They do a lot of analysis, mostly immigration court stuff, but also the intersection of immigration and the criminal justice system. And then Pew Research Center is also good. And at the same time, you have places like the ACLU and Freedom for Immigrants, where they work a lot with the detained people who are detained by ICE.
Mm-hmm.
And they do their own analysis of data they got through FOIA. And I think, obviously they're advocates and advocacy organizations, and they want, they'll present it maybe a certain way, and just keep that in mind. But good places to start if you are a person that wants to learn more. But for next steps, I'm in this weird position where I don't, I'm not someone that gets to decide what the next steps are, but, I will tell people if, we're looking at the issue of, when people say defund ICE, what does that actually mean? Look at what, you have to look at the budgets that are being proposed, by Congress. And, the House, they had a proposal for one that, defunded ICE and it took money away from detention specifically, no money for the border wall. And if that's something that interests you, right, look at that and then see how your local elected official is voting one way or another. Because the budgets are a little, it can be a little boring, but I think that's really where these calls to, at least when we talk about ICE or Border Patrol, to change, that's where you can see it. Because when you give money, when Congress gives these agencies money, they also have certain requirements that come with the money. There was a House committee report led by Democrats that looked at medical care in ICE detention. And one of the proposals in there was, and then they found that it wasn't great, which we all know, because I've been covering this for a while. But they said one thing that we should do is if we're going to give ICE money, these specific detention centers, if they don't meet the standards, we should not be giving them money. And that's and so there's all these proposals. Whether they'll go anywhere or not is a whole other story. But I would say next steps, look at that.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And I'm sorry I skipped over you for those great specific information about where to get sources. So Nick, how about you? Next steps?
Yeah. So I was just thinking about what Adolfo had said, even with, because I kind of skipped over these sources as well, but I use the Prison Policy Institute a lot for stats, even though they're not encompassing quite entirely of Indigenous people. I think the Blue Leaks data leak that had just happened is being completely underutilized. Most people don't even know what it is. We actually used it to study policing in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and how these big box chains were sharing data that they had collected to police, to basically create the policing initiatives for the Albuquerque Police Department. And this was released in Blue Leaks. So it was Target and Walmart, right, specifically, and they had accounted for 63% of the arrests in Albuquerque. So if you want to connect the role of police with these corporations, this is a completely underutilized kind of leak, I think. And it gets to what Adolfo says, and even within the next steps is that people actually have to do research, and they actually have to get in and look at these things, whether it's talking with people on the ground or whether it's going through this stuff. It's not fun. As a historian, I love to do it. I love to sit through archives. That's my game, that's my jam, but not everyone wants to do that, And so I think there is a space, or there should be a space for people to be able to have these opportunities to do it. And I think now, even with, what Charlene was saying with, being given all these opportunities, I have the choice now to pick what projects I want to do. And that's kind of been a benefit, because I would actually prefer to do these projects versus oh, well, we only have space if you cover this one issue, and that has been a shift. But I think more than ever though, it's it shouldn't be non-Indigenous, or at least outlets and publishers that don't have like that experience determining the agenda for what gets researched and what doesn't get researched. And that, I'll just say this over and over again, we are completely underrepresented in the news media. There can never be enough of us, right? There can never be enough of us writing these stories. There can never be enough of us publishing books, doing podcasts and things like that. We operate on a spirit of abundance versus like a spirit of like scarcity and competition, right? And so I think we're seeing that more with Indigenous journalists, researchers, writers, academics. And I think that's the only way we're going to like buck the system, is if we actually like collectively engage in these projects versus just letting them determine, you know, what those stories are.
Right. Thank you. Charlene, next steps.
That's because we started the conversation thinking about our own writing. What's next, and what I'm seeing happening already are people leaning more into their creative selves. Even people who are like day-to-day or primarily do community organizing or communications work, people are saying, you know, I'm going to revisit the parts of myself that were more creative or more squarely cultural work or artistic, my artwork. And I think the more of us do, the more of us who do that work, the better. I think that more people should feel less limited by whatever, but be it disciplinary boundaries, be it what we're told we're supposed to do as community organizers and activists, but to move out well outside of the boundaries that people and institutions have given to us, and ones that we have internalized, like this is the one way to do it, this is the right way to do it. I think that's absolutely what's next, given what I see happening now. I also anticipate there's going to be a slew of books, films, and things that are about this particular moment and about racism, anti-racism, white supremacy, all these things. And not all of it's going to be good. Some of it is just going to be, well, you got the book contract, so you're going to write the thing because you got the book contract, or you got the green light for the series or the film. So there's going to be a lot of things that come out. And my hope is that the good stuff, the stuff that's critical, the things that agitate us, make us think, are generative, are celebratory, are telling different stories, are more holistic, come to the forefront. And the stuff that's just recycling, same old, is minimal. But I'm not confident that it will be. I think people are going to continue to write the kind of world that we want to live in. Like many people are leaning into Octavia Butler's work these days, and organizing in of course more ways than one. And there's this book called Octavia's Brood, and I really highly recommend people read it. And it's actually written by Adrienne Marie Brown and Walida Emarisha. And the reason why I bring that up is because Walida talks about organizing as science fiction. And I think that people are going to continue to write the world that we want through science fiction, through critical theory, in ethnic studies, in performance study, whatever, in all types of mediums. People are going to continue to write, and they're going to do it in ways that we're used to, and in a lot of ways that we're not used to.
Yeah. I think that's a great point about. I do see a lot of people breaking out of internalized silos like that. Like if you're an academic, you don't do creative things, and you see that people are just like, wait, this is part of systemic racism if I think that I only do one type of work. So I think that's a great point. So in our last few minutes, I wonder if you all could offer 3 bits of kind of specific advice to make things better going forward. Like what 3 things do you think people should be doing and to make some real change going forward? And I'll let you all decide by unmuting who wants to go first.
I can go first.
All right.
I'll share historian, activist, organizer, Black feminist historian, activist organizer, Dr. Barbara Ransby, tells us that we have three things that we need to do. And she said this during the Black National Convention hosted by the Electoral Justice Project of the Movement for Black Lives. She said that our three things are to study, to struggle, and to serve. And those are the things that we can all do in whatever way possible. Everybody can study, if it's through film, if it's through conversation, if it's through reading, whatever that is. Everybody can struggle with each other around ideas, vision, strategy, and everybody can serve in whatever capacity that they have. So that's what I think we can all do. I'm following what Barbara told me as usual.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Nick or Adolfo?
The standoff. Yeah, I'm in a weird spot where I can't say like this is what we should do, and this is I hate that in many ways, but also the point is I would tell people that as we have these conversations about police reform and defunding agencies, if that does happen, right? They say, okay, we're going to take money away from these police departments and funnel them into these community programs, or from I think one of the proposals was to take money away from DHS and put it into alternatives to detention. I think the next step is like make sure we keep an eye on whether our elected officials do what they say they're going to do. As a reporter, as a watchdog, that's my role, but it's also residents also can do that, and staying on top of how any change is actually carried out, because I think very often we'll see people in government say, okay, we did this, but then you look at it and you wait some time and you realize no, that's not how it actually played out. And so I would.
You just bought them more cars.
Right. Like,
that wasn't defunding. That was like.
Yeah, no, I don't know. To me, that's, I know it's not three things, but I think that's.
No, well, how about I ask you a different question? Because I think as a reporter, it's hard for you to give that kind of advice. But if you had a magic wand, what three things would you change about your job?
More money. I'm kidding now.
Why would you be kidding about that?
I think I would want the industry as a whole to have, and especially these newsrooms, like legacy newsrooms, to have actual honest conversations about objectivity, and not just that, but also when we talk about diversity, not just play lip service, because we're seeing a lot of that happening in newsrooms right now because of this, the reckoning, and so, but they might put someone up in this position that's like a woman of color on the masthead, but how much power does she actually have? And if I had a magic wand, I would give her all the power that she needs to actually do the job that she is asked to do. Because I will tell you without naming, newspaper, they'll have a tendency to elevate folks to these positions, but they sort of set them up to fail. And then they're like, oh, well, we gave them the spot and then they just couldn't do it. And so I would want to change that. And yeah, I don't know. I'll stop there.
I like it. More money and more power for the people, BIPOC people in power.
Yes.
All right, Nick, 3 bits of advice or 3 things you want to change?
I don't really have, I can't list it as eloquently as as Charlene did, but I do want to think about, I made my answers in this kind of broader appeal, I guess. I've been really in this moment in time, I think like everyone, I've been having this moment of reflection on what's happening, how did we get to this point? And I've been actually studying those in power and trying to figure out how they got to this point, because this is a long-term strategy. This is going back to the 50s at least. They were planning these kinds of this kind of counter-revolution, right? And, I read a lot about Roger Ailes, the guy who invented Fox News, and how they use culture industries to actually to build like a political platform and to run candidates and to like get ideas that would never, would be absurd 2 decades ago that are now being talked about, and conditioning us psychologically, like by allowing 300 or 200,000 people to die, and saying that it's okay that like 300, there's a good sizable portion of this population in this country is okay with the possibility of 300,000 people dying. That is wild if you think about it, right? It's absolutely wild. But it doesn't, in the study of the right and how they came to power and how these ideas have become popularized and normalized within segments of the population, have kept these people in power. We also need to understand that our goal is not to become a minority, or on the margins, or just happy with like broom closets the rest of our life. It's kind of what Adolfo was saying. Saying that like we actually want the whole thing, like we deserve all of this, we deserve this space, we deserve to have our ideas like talked about like respectfully. We actually have to have people in these positions of power. We can't be afraid of power. We can't be afraid of building power. We can't be afraid of losing. We can't be afraid of winning. But that requires a long-term strategy, right? And actually building institutions. And I think there is a widespread disaffection with and disillusionment with like our current media, right? And the right has played up on that, and they've used it to their advantage. And we've kind of stuck to defending our institutions. What institutions, like what are they, what are they like, what is there to defend, and it's not, I'm not asking that in a rhetorical way. I'm saying like, really, what is there to defend? Yeah. And what are we offering as an alternative, as a narrative? The only way we can do that is actually by building institutions and strengthening the kinds of stories that we write, but also by building up, writers, thinkers, creative people who are revisioning the world in a way that we see ourselves in it, right? Because currently there's no place for us right now. Yeah. Like that's abundantly clear. And so that would be my appeal. Like that's like more than 3 things, but it's studying the right, but then also building up our own institutions and understanding that we need a long-term vision and program. And we can't be afraid of power either.
All right. Well, I think that's the perfect way to end. I'm joining whatever new institution you 3 build. I am hopeful after talking with you guys that, if we can get our power and voices used collectively, we can make some larger change than what has been imagined so far. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And be well, friends.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.